As you can see, there is a full agenda today, so I will get on with starting so that we can get on to the really interesting things. And we have the pleasure later on of introducing Cees Hoesmans of Tregroes Waffles, who's going to tell you his story about his journey into employee ownership. And we've also got John Taylorson with us as well, who's the programme manager for Wales Food and Drink Cluster, who's going to have a discussion about selling businesses in general. Next slide, please, Ebony. So just to give you a little bit of background on the Wales Cooperative Centre, we were set up in 1982 by the TUC to combat mass redundancies. And the TUC believed that co-ops, mutuals and employee-owned businesses could play a vital role in supporting the loss of jobs. So if any of you of a certain age on this webinar today will remember Tower Colliery. Well, Tower Colliery was the first client of the Wales Cooperative Centre that we worked with in relation to employee ownership. So for those who are unaware, British Coal closed Tower Colliery in 1994 on the grounds that it would be uneconomical to continue production. So the Wales Co-op Centre came in and supported 239 employees who pooled their redundancy money of £8,000 to purchase the mine, and it reopened in 1995, providing 13 extra years of employment. So this is a really good example of employee-owned businesses which safeguarded a local business and safeguarded local jobs. And again, we'll hear from Cees later on about his particular business. Next slide, please, Ebony. So just to give you, bring you up to the current day. So the Wales Co-op Centre, we deliver the Social Business Wales programme. This, for those who will not know, is actually the sister programme to Business Wales. But where we differ is we deliver specialist bespoke support to growth and startup social businesses all across Wales. Next slide, please, Ebony. I'd like to introduce you to the team. So this is the Employee Ownership Wales team, and we sit within the Social Business Wales programme. So we have the programme manager, who is Nick. Unfortunately, Nick couldn't be with us this morning. And then we've got three specialist business advisors, including myself. And you will hear shortly from Branwen and Paul to talk about what we do and employee ownership trusts. So the key role of our programme is to promote employee ownership and planned succession. And we provide specialist advice supporting owners and employees through the entire succession process. Just to note that we are a fully funded resource. So apart from certain legal costs, our support is free. And out of Wales, this specialist support could actually cost upwards of £40,000 in other areas. So as you'll see, we provide huge value for money. We have supported over 50 businesses from a variety of sectors. And we are going to hear today, obviously, from the food sector and Tregroes Waffles, but we've done things from TV production companies to dentistry, through to financial management, architecture. So it just shows the diverse range of businesses within the employee ownership sector. So next slide, please, Ebony. So the employee ownership team hope that this will be the start of your journey today. So we're going to give you a whistle-stop overview of employee ownership, which hopefully will lead on to questions and where you start to consider your future and the success of your company with EO as part of its future. But we obviously can't go on and not mention the major impact that COVID has had on the economy. Leaders in business have had to operate at an unimaginable pace, be resilient and engage with a lot of creativity. Challenges of the pandemic have brought unprecedented times. So we have to question ourselves as to what comes next. Therefore, there has never been a more important time to consider different forms of business and succession. Next slide, please, Ebony. In Wales, SMEs account for 99% of the business count, so we are particularly vulnerable to SME succession failure. And we are particularly reliant here on micro businesses, and rural areas depend heavily on key employers. And this is an example of that Kate will be talking about later. But alarmingly, 1/3 of all business closures within the UK are down to succession failures, i.e. owners not planning for succession. And particularly in Wales, family businesses are an important part of our landscape, and yet there appears to be lack of any formal planning, with nearly half of the businesses having no succession plan in place at all. So why is this important? Well, research shows that only 12% of family firms make it to the third generation. So looking at other succession options is extremely important. So in conclusion, really, I'd like to say that succession planning is undertaken, unfortunately, in a very reactive fashion. So next slide, please, Ebony. So many business owners assume that selling the business to an external trade sale is actually the only option, but yet PwC, who interviewed for a study that was undertaken, widely agreed that for anything below a £5 million turnover, it's actually very hard to find interested buyers, even for successful, profitable businesses. Engaging in a trade sale, for instance, may require owners to open their books to competitors who just may be on a fishing expedition rather than genuinely being interested in buying the business. So that means they could want them to sign up to warranties that create a legacy of personal risk for those owners. There's always a market for a sale, and it entirely depends on the price. So finding a buyer willing to offer the right price is the key challenge for SME owners wishing to pursue an external sale for their business. Generally speaking, stakeholders pointed out that where debt is part of the financial package, the finance provider can actually determine the price because risks have to be matched. Next slide, please, Ebony. Succession planning needs to combine and weave together a plethora of different perspective, dimensions and requirements in order to satisfy the needs of the different stakeholders involved while finding a viable solution for the business and the outgoing owner going forward. So we have to remember that succession is really about evolution and not just about retirement, as a lot of people may think. Next slide, please, Ebony. So I'm just going to quickly go through the main, most well-used options for succession. So although a trade sale is often the most obvious exit route for a business owner, the market for the sale of small businesses, as I've mentioned, is often limited, and a business owner can struggle to find a buyer. So whilst this may yield a good return to the owner, it can be risky and quite difficult to arrange. A trade sale can present the danger of exposing the business to ruthless competitors, as I've already mentioned, as a way to obtain confidential information under the pretense of an interested purchaser. So this could lead to long-term damage to the business. But also selling out to a competitor may also mean the loss of independence for that business and the loss of jobs amongst the workforce. Also, some may consider the founder's knowledge and networks as critical. So the viability going forward, but these are not regarded as sellable. So management buyout usually involves the senior managers purchasing the business by investing their own money, often with funds provided by venture capitalists. This route is very common and is the preferred route for conventional business advisors and investors. However, if the VC can see a future trade sale as their exit route, then it brings with it all the problems of a trade sale again, albeit deferred. So it's just that continuing circle of needing to sell potentially in another 5 years. A management buyout also has the potential to be divisive within the company if the general workforce is excluded from the buyout. A sale of the business assets or a voluntary winding up is likely to yield the lowest return to the owner, and tax charges can still be levied on any profit made. So in the absence of forward planning, this may become the only option you have left, but it means that a perfectly viable business can be lost, as I've mentioned earlier. I'm now going to hand you over to my colleague Branwen Ellis, who's going to introduce employee ownership and the proven benefits.
Thank you, Sarah. Bore da, everyone. Next slide, please, Ebony. So picking up on Sarah's, last option on her slide, employee ownership, let's take a couple of minutes just to look at sort of, employee ownership in greater detail, which, we do believe is a great succession solution, although some might say that we're biased. Next slide, please, Ebony. So what do we mean, first of all, by employee ownership? Well, we consider a business to be employee owned when it's significantly owned by its employees. This could be through, either an employee ownership trust model, or it could be through employees owning individual shares directly in the business, or it could be, a mixture of both, a hybrid model. My colleague Paul will be talking about that later. Next slide, please, Ebony. So we just want to give you a flavour of some of the employee-owned businesses here in Wales. You'll see that they range really in terms of the sectors, from architect firms, financial services providers, training providers. We've got scientific sort of instrument manufacturers, TV production companies and dental practices. And last but not least, Tregroy's Waffles, which is a real treat if you've got a sweet tooth like myself. And we'll be hearing from Case later on in terms of their personal experience. Next slide, please, Ebony. And here are some other employee-owned businesses operating across the UK and some globally. You may or may not be surprised to learn that they're employee-owned. Again, we've got the cute and cuddly Shaun the Sheep at the top of the screen there. Creation of Admin Animations in Bristol, which became employee-owned in the last 3 years, along with Richer Sounds and Riverford Organics. We've got probably the cutest dragon on earth in the middle there, which you may recognise from the John Lewis Christmas adverts. John Lewis is possibly the most well-known, employee-owned business here in the UK. And then top of the screen, sort of on the right there, you've got the more industrious sort of Unipark group, equally proud, I might say, of their employee ownership culture. But they've got a different model to the John Lewis model, in that the majority of the shares of the company are owned by the employees. And then Arup, another company that operates globally with over 15,000 employees, has been employee-owned, for decades now, and are very proud of the founder's sort of legacy. Next slide, please, Ebony. Okay, so before I hand over to Paul, let's just look at why employee ownership is good for business and the Welsh economy in general. I suppose really the concept that underpins employee ownership is this concept of shared responsibility, risk and reward. So what you have is a model where employees, being the co-owners of that business, enjoy greater levels of engagement, and generally report to be more fulfilled in their roles. And I guess, as a result of this, some of the advantages of employee ownership include increased productivity. In June 2020, research was undertaken on the productivity of the top 50 employee-owned companies, and they were performing at 6.9% increase in productivity compared to 1% across the UK in mainstream businesses. Greater efficiency and improved margins is really interesting, actually, to sort of hear businesses talk about how they've actually become more efficient, and they've got the entire team looking at how they might improve their profitability. We had one example, a food manufacturing business, saying that actually the staff on the production line had come up with the idea of downgrading the disposable gloves that they used, and what the previous owner was saying, if they'd introduced that idea, they'd have been up in arms, sort of trying to sort of get everybody to use, a less superior product, if you like. But, the employees themselves had said, well, actually, we can make do with a sort of, the second next best disposable glove on the market. And as a consequence, have saved £10,000 every year. We also see greater levels of innovation generally. What previous business owners report is that, once employees get into that mindset of being business owners, they're thinking about the longer term strategy. And quite often employees have a greater risk appetite compared to maybe somebody that's thinking about their exit from the business. We hear about reduced absenteeism due to the fact that people are feeling more sort of fulfilled in their roles. And also, on the last session that we ran, we had Hugh from BIC Innovation that confirmed really that being employee owned has really helped them to improve their recruitment and retention of talented, committed staff. And we're finding more and more business owners wanting to sort of dip their toe in the water, so to speak, and start introducing share plans to employees as a means of keeping talented staff within the business and recruiting others. And of course, better resilience to economic turbulence. Early research suggests that during COVID, employee-owned businesses have been sort of quicker, if you like, to unite employees behind sort of, either hibernation strategies or pivoting strategies. So in general, they will come together to look at the longer term well-being of the business. I suppose in terms of another, benefits, I think it provides a succession plan for owners that enables them to keep the businesses and jobs rooted in their community. And obviously, this has a greater sort of impact on the entire Welsh economy. There's a lot of businesses that could have been, have been sold, assets stripped, shut down, resulting in the loss of jobs, And by keeping those businesses in the community and those jobs, we're also helping sort of money circulate in the local economy. I've just put a How Wolves Change Rivers here at the bottom for anybody that's interested in wildlife or ecosystem. There's a lovely video on YouTube in terms of how introducing a handful of wolves in the Yellowstone National Park in the States changed the entire ecosystem. And I suppose you could say that about employee ownership, that, over time it could have the same effect. So I'll hand you over now to my colleague, Paul, who will be talking in greater detail about the options available to you as business owners. Okay, thank you, Paul.
Hello, good morning, Bore da. Thank you for joining us today. With this morning, I'm going to be talking a little bit about general principles of employee ownership, in particular the use of an employee ownership trust. I'm going to slightly orientate this towards food companies, but the general principles are applicable to any kind of businesses. And one of the reasons why we've labelled today's meeting as particular interest the food industry is because we believe that there needs to be a higher take-up of the employee ownership trust approach within food companies. So can you move to the next slide, please, Ebony? So just recapping again, we've covered this just earlier on, but it's a really critical slide actually, because it gives you a very clear picture, once understood, of the options that you might have for a sale. So first of all, we've got direct ownership, where in this situation, employees actually become individual shareholders of the company. And I suppose typically examples of that would be the management buyout that has been mentioned before, where managers come together collectively to own and buy shares in the company. Also, within the food sector, for example, we have a number of important employee-owned cooperatives, such as SUMA, in which they have what we call a cooperative model. So they're essentially based upon shares, but the voting powers within the company are equal for all of the employees. So it's a more democratic model than you would find in a generalized share company, where normally the more shares you own, the more votes you have, and the greater the element of control in the company. So these are kind of examples of direct ownership, where individuals would have a share certificate which proves that they own the shares of the company. Alternative to that is the concept of indirect ownership. Specifically today, I'm talking about the employee ownership trust model. Now, in this case, all of the shares in the company, or some of the shares in the company, often a majority, are collectively held on behalf of the employees. So essentially, the share certificate is made out to the trust. The trust is managed by a series of trustees who look after the interests of the employees. They interact with the trading company's board and make sure that anything that the company does has some relevance and some interest and some benefits for the employees. And then we also have a hybrid of those two. So you can have a situation where a sale is made to a trust, but at the same time, you might want to reward one or two key managers, or more than that maybe, by allowing them to buy shares in the company. So you can have a situation where you have indirect, owned by the trust, and direct, owned by specific named managers perhaps, or other key people who you want to involve in the ownership of the company. So those are the three kind of key models. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the ownership trust model, because that's our focus for today. But in my own work, I'm involved in doing management buyouts as well. So looking at the kind of issues of what's best, is it best to go an MBO, or is it best to go to an EOT? Those are the kind of questions which most people tend to ask. Next slide, please. Just a reminder, really, that we're talking here about business sales. So in order to have a business sale, you need a willing seller and a willing buyer. So key to that will, of course, be the company valuation. And we do lots of valuations. And sometimes the valuations that come out are a pleasant surprise to owners. In some cases, not so much. But the issue of vendor expectations is quite critical, really. So what is the vendor, the seller, looking for from the transaction? It's important to clarify that in your own mind when you sell the business. You know, are you looking for the full value of your business as confirmed by the valuation? Are you willing to have a negotiation around that? Are you interested in remaining with the company? Would you like to be a consultant with the company? Would you like to be a board director of the company? These are all part of what I call vendor expectations. And we spend quite a lot of time with owners helping them to clarify what they want. It's not easy selling a business, is it really? So an outside person sometimes can be very helpful in that debate. And then, of course, there's the buyer expectations. In this case, we're talking primarily about employees buying, but demonstrating to them that they can buy the company, that it's financially sustainable. That's quite important and quite critical. So we will spend time with employees and managers, helping them to plan the business going forward. Ultimately, the future needs of the business are critical. If you were a trade sale buyer, a trade buyer of a business, say a food business, then you'd be thinking about the ways in which what you might have to offer would add value to and perhaps minimize costs to the future needs of that business. The same kind of methodology and thought process needs to be applied in the case of employees and in a management buyout, managers, to really work out actually what does the business need in the future, and are they best placed to meet the needs of the business? And if not, what else needs to be done to ensure that the business can grow and prosper? Next slide, please. Employee ownership trusts. Now, these have become a really hot thing within the employee ownership world since 2014, when the Finance Act, following a report by Graham Nuttall, which made proposals to try and simplify the whole idea of trust ownership of companies. So since 2014, this has become the model of choice for employee ownership. In fact, across the United Kingdom now, we have upwards of 500 companies that are owned by employee ownership trusts. When I say they're owned by employee ownership trust, I mean that the employee ownership trust owns the majority or all of the shares in the company. The reason it's become popular is it's a very clear and flexible approach, which offers stability for the longer term. And there are also tax incentives for shareholders and tax incentives for employees as well. The other aspect of this which needs to be remembered is it's an all-employee approach. So the trustees are interested in benefits for all of the employees. So they can't do things which would favour an employee. So, for example, they can't lend money to an individual employee because that would be against the all-employee approach. Next slide, please. So how does the EOT work? And forgive me for using the term EOT. It is now part of our parlance. People are talking about MBOs and EOTs and MBOs versus EOTs. We're in the world of shorthand, I suppose. So forgive me for that, but it's a bit easier to talk in terms using the abbreviation. So how does the EOT work? Well, it's essentially a trust arrangement. So a settler, namely a company or a founder of a company, transfers assets, in this case, usually shares, to a second party, namely a trust, usually a trust company set up for that purpose, on behalf of a third party, namely the employees. So in nearly every EOT that I've seen, the trustee is usually a corporate trustee, which is registered as a company at Companies House. It can be a share company, but more often it's a company limited by guarantee and it's registered at Companies House. So you can go and look up trustee companies on Company House if you want to. So you could go and, for example, look up Riverford Organics, which is substantially owned by an employee trust. And you'll find that the major shareholder in that is the Employee Ownership Trust, and the former founder owner is owning a minority of shares now. Now the company has been sold in majority to the Employee Ownership Trust. So the trust company is independent of the trading company. So in that sense, it has to have some independence, but it's also linked to it through a document, which is called a trust deed. And part of the important work that goes on in employee ownership trust sales is writing and confirming what that trust deed actually is. So it will have, for example, arrangements in there for who can be a beneficiary. Should all employees be beneficiaries, or should employees have to serve a certain amount of time before they become a beneficiary? Under the Finance Act of 2014, all employees have to be considered, and the maximum amount of time that you can make a new employee wait before becoming a beneficiary is I think, a year. So in general, you would usually find that most employees become beneficiaries after a period of, say, 6 months. But all of that's set out in this document, which is called a trust deed. Next slide, please. So how do you sell your shares if you're an owner to an EOT? Well, an EOT is set up to acquire the company, or usually a majority of shares in the company for the benefit of the employees. How's it funded? Well, it can be funded by surplus monies, which may be residing in the trading company, which the trading company can gift to the trust. Or alternatively, it can raise money, just as you would in a management buyout, by obtaining a loan from a funder to finance the purchase. And usually, looking at the last point on the slide, usually in all of these arrangements, and that includes MBOs as well as EOT transactions, there's usually an element of the consideration which is what we call deferred. In other words, the owner doesn't get all of the cash when signing the sale and purchase agreement. He gets usually a substantial amount, but usually some of the money is deferred. And this is something which lenders are particularly keen on. They like to see the departing owner having some interest in the company moving forward, because it helps them confer and evidence their security. It gives them more confidence in that. So we've got a number of lenders who are quite happy to lend to these kind of arrangements. We've got the Bank of Wales now, who have lent to a number of these transactions. We have specialised funders such as Triodos Bank, ThinCats, another one, and these organisations are now lending to usually directly to the EOT itself, which is then using the money to buy the shares, or in some cases they're lending to the trading company, which then gifts money to the EOT. Some thought has to go into, as part of the legal due diligence, what is the best way of doing that, because it's different for each company. Next slide, please. So why do people like this model? Well, it really has minimum disruption to trading. Some of the other models, such as a management buyout, can be quite divisive in terms of how they operate within companies. This model is a business as usual model, so it's particularly of interest to companies who are really interested, for example, such as architects who are interested in the practice of architecture rather than the business of running a business. Obviously, business owners sometimes enjoy running businesses, but quite a few do it because that's the way it is. You know, I wanted to do this, and I found myself as a business owner. So in that sense, the EOT model will allow the business to run pretty much as normal with a minimum of disruption, providing, of course, that you have in place a good management team. And that's an overriding comment in all of these situations. So if you're thinking of selling your business, make sure you've got a good management team in place. Whatever model you choose, that will be very important, particularly if loans are required to finance the transaction. It gives stability. It ensures that the company will always exist for the benefit of the employees. It means that the employees have some say in the future sale of a company. That's very important because it gives them additional security. It may be one of the reasons why trust-owned companies perform better par on par with other the other types of commercial concern. Next slide, please. So it's a tax advantage scheme. If you as an owner sell your shares, a majority of your shareholding, to an employee ownership trust, that transaction is currently totally free of capital gains tax. And normally you will be paying business assets sale tax on that, which will be 10% if it met certain requirements, or it could be 28% if it didn't. But in this situation, it's a tax-free arrangement, provided that certain conditions are met. And those conditions are relatively straightforward, actually, in most cases. So all of the employees have to be involved, so they have to all be beneficiaries of the trust. They all have to be treated equally, and it's the job of the trustees to ensure that that's the case. There's a limited participation requirement, so if you have also alongside the trust direct shareholdings, you have to be careful that the number of people who own more than 5% of the share capital don't exceed a certain ratio. I think it's 40% of the total number of employees in the company. So, and the other condition is that the transaction, because it's tax advantaged, has to be at market value. There's quite a lot of scope in that, obviously, because valuations are capable of interpretation. But by and large, you want to have something which is defensible to the HMRC. Next slide, please. So just a reminder of the capital gains tax advantage, but also if the EOT has a controlling interest, the company can pay bonuses to its employees, and the employees will enjoy an additional tax-free amount of £3,600 a year. So that's a real tangible benefit that employees will get. Next slide, please. How these companies run that are owned by trusts? Well, they're run in the same way as any other company. So the job of the trustees is to look after the long-term interests of the beneficiaries. They're also required to appoint the board of directors, which usually isn't an issue because everyone will want the most effective board that they can possibly find for the company after the sale. The board of the directors make most of the decisions, like setting company goals and directing the management team. And the management team are responsible for delivering the success to the board. An example of a food company that uses an employee ownership trust is Riverford Organics, which is a very well known and highly reputable company in the food sector. Guyson Watson was the original founder. It was a family-owned business. They were skeptical of any business sale which involved outside investors because they wanted to do the best for everybody in the company, not for the investors. The children weren't interested. Guy himself wanted to leave some kind of legacy, and he had certain kind of passionate values which he believed in relating to the provision of organic food. So he decided that the EOT gave him the best protection for that. So he sold 74% of his shares to that EOT and retained 26%. In doing the transaction, he is also on record of saying that he didn't charge the market price because whilst he was interested in a return for the money and for his family, he also wanted to give the employee owners the best start they could possibly have by ensuring that the debt in the company was minimized. So there are a number of factors there which you might want to take on board, but clearly owners who have certain values, this model will appeal to you very strongly. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm just going to very quickly mention that there are a number of schemes which are tax advantaged, which can be used in conjunction with employee ownership. One of these is share options, where certain selected employees are offered options to buy shares at the value of the shares today. But if the company, if the valuation of those shares goes up, for example, in 3 or 4 years, then they can buy them at the price that they would have paid today. So it gives them some incentive for growth, and there are tax advantages for that. And also might be interested to particularly high growth food companies who are starting off, the idea of growth shares, where there is a additional class of share introduced, which doesn't have any kind of value attached to it until the value of the company reaches a certain level, certain hurdle level, the technical term is for it. Once it reaches that hurdle level, then the owners of those shares can have enjoy some of the benefits of value, so they can sell those shares at that higher value. The reason growth shares have become important is because some companies want to gift shares to potential employee shareholders, and by doing it through this route, because there is no value attached to that special class of share until it reaches the hurdle value, it doesn't represent a taxable gift in the eyes of HMRC. And there are a number of other options there, which if people are interested in, they can come back and we'll be very happy to have a discussion about. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, it's my great pleasure today to introduce Kees Huismans, who I'm pleased to say has worked with for a number of years now. Kees was the founder and is the managing director of Tregroes Waffles, a very important Welsh food company. I'm pleased to say that in working with him, in helping him to sell the interest in his company over a period of years, it's been a very pleasant, enjoyable task from my perspective. Hopefully it has been from his as well, but he'll tell you in a moment. And he's become a very good friend of ours. So I'm very pleased to introduce Kees today to talk about his experience as a founder who had the problem of deciding what he was going to do with his business. Kees.
Thank you, Paul. God, you can talk. I'd forgotten how well you can talk. Well, everybody, really, there isn't much for me to say. I mean, everything that I've been listening to in the presentation so far sounds very recognizable in relation to the experiences we've gone through over the last 5 years, I suppose. Tregroes Waffles was started from very sort of nimble origins. We started selling waffles in the local markets and fairs and streets, and over the years the business grew. And as it was described, I found myself running a business rather than being a simple little waffle man. And I had to sort of adapt to that whole idea and work with. It became more and more complicated as the company grew, and we got a management team. And over what I sort of have seen over the years in the food business is that perfectly good businesses were where the owners came to the end of their useful life. They were being sold, and then all sorts of problems occurred. They weren't the same flourishing company as that they were before. And I thought, what a pity. They were such good companies, and they didn't manage to sort of get a sustainable future for themselves as soon as the founder disappeared. That was one of the reasons. The other reason is, if you do something for 35, 40 years, you become, well, I have become, I don't know whether in general that is true, but I have become less driven And when I was young and beautiful, it was always trying to build the empire and getting the empire bigger. And as you grow older in life, there are more important things in life than just running a business. And you don't want that pressure all the time. But at the same time, I felt I still had a lot to give as well. I didn't want to retire, because what do you do when you retire? Make waffles. It's I want to contribute to the company as well, and I couldn't see how that would work if I tried to sell my company. Plus, you got all the insecurity of, is my business really worth having if it is not about me? If is the business worth anything on its own? So you got those sort of doubts, and it's not easy to sell the business. When I was a long time ago, one of my customers is the John Lewis Partnership, and I went to a conference center that was run by them, and there was a little girl from Yorkshire who'd started the day before working for the John Lewis Partnership, and she brought us a cup of coffee, and I asked her what her position was and what she did there, and she said, "I am a partner," and she was really proud of the fact that although she only worked there for one day, she was a partner. And that might be a very simple outlook on life, but in the end, if you feel that you own something, that is the proudest thing you can do, isn't it? Now, I didn't want John Jones, who has been a waffle man with me and who was my production manager, to own my company privately as an individual, because he gets the same problem as me. He grows older, and then he has to go, and then the company is into a flux again. So I really like the idea that the company is owned by this trust. I can be in that trust. The family is in the trust. The employees are in the trust, and there is an outside body. If the family and the employees, for whatever reason, don't agree, there is a third outside body that is in the trust. And between the three of trustees, we have to decide what is best for the benefit of the employees. And I like that system very much. So from that point of view, I was fully engaged with the trust idea. Now, what I didn't like about the trust idea at all is it becomes very, very complicated in terms of the legal business of it. It was definitely at the time, maybe things have changed now, but at the time, I spent a lot of time thinking about how I want this trust to function and what the rules and regulations of it should be, and how it can run a trading company, and how it can work for the benefit of the employees, how it has to sort out issues and troubles and all different scenarios. And we will never know whether that trust has been set up in a way that will answer to all those issues unless they happen. And I can tell you, my normal house, kitchen and garden solicitor, I showed him all the paperwork for it, and he didn't understand one iota of it. And I'm only a simple waffle man. I was meant to understand it. And that is really difficult with these trusts. It's a very specialized legal bit of paper. But it sits there as a security document. That's how I see it. It sits there just in case things go wrong. We have to go back to that document there and make sure that we sort it out for the benefit of the employees, which gives me the freedom that I need, because everybody is involved now at a level of their ability at their very best. And it means that rather than before, I was the owner of the business and everything had to come from me, now lots of ideas come from my staff. And really, I'm only needed sort of in a grandfather type scenario where I have to sort of look at different things and put my penny's worth in. But as such, it has equalized the business, and it has relieved me from lots of pressures and lots of responsibility, while I still can be involved and play to my heart's delight. And as long as I feel that I can contribute, I'm an employee as everybody else, and that's great. We never paid enough to our employees for them to be able to buy the company from me. The company was worth more than what I could expect them to have earned. So the business has to make a profit. The business was valued originally, then the business makes a profit, and 10% of the value of the business gets transferred to the trust every year. Then we have a meeting whether the trust wants to buy those shares of me. So the trust is given the money from the bakery. The trust then spends that money to buy the shares from me. So my retirement money comes available. The people are not really paying from their own private money, but the bakery makes enough profit to buy those shares. It takes 10% per year. So over 10 years, the business is transferred to the employees. We are in the 6th year, and we come to this tipping point where the majority share goes to the employees. So at the moment, the employees owe 49% and the family owns 51%. Next year, the family will own 40% and the employees will own 60%. And really, the other thing that has been agreed in that trust deed is that if the board decides that they want to get rid of me, then they can, and I've got no right of appeal. And those are all the right things, and it allows the company sort of to flourish and develop, and not be held back by me losing my drive and becoming an old fart. So I hope I can see that if anybody can make a success of this company in the future, it should be my employees, who have seen how I have sort of built the company over all these years and how it has developed. They know what the strengths and weaknesses of this company are more and better than anybody. And I got confidence that they will make a success of it. And that is something I am very proud of them. It enables me to retire. It enables me to have my value back out of the business. It enables me to know, and that's one of the conditions that is in the trust, that the company will stay here in Llandersill. It's not moved from the area, so it will provide employment here. And I know that the people who are running it are the people who helped build it up in the first place, and I've got the biggest chance of making a success of it. And I can continue to be involved as a board member on the trust. So if once a year I can, in any case, put my penny's worth in to make sure that to help support the business for the benefit of the employees. And that is a very privileged position to be in, I think. So from that point of view, I feel much better with an employee ownership trust, where I can still have some involvement with the company, with the trust, rather than that it was sold to a bigger conglomerate or to somebody completely alien to what I am. And I would feel that I would lose all contact with it. So it's the best of both worlds. I think after all the talking that's been going on, that's probably as much as I want to say at the moment, Paul. And if there's any questions, or you want to sort of come into in any aspects of this whole process, feel free by all means.
Thank you, Kees. That's wonderful. I mean, you know, you really paint a picture with such honesty and such care, and it's really appreciative. We really appreciate that, and I'm sure that the people listening today will have found that really helpful. I think that, you know, we can talk till the cows comes home, as you've said, about this, but ultimately it's what people like yourselves who are doing it in practice, that's really the key issue. Thank you so much. And I'd now like to introduce John Taylorson. John is the program manager at Sustainable Scale Up Cluster with the Food and Drink Wales. I think I'm right in saying he is an employee of Big Innovation, who have the responsibility of managing that cluster. But more importantly, John has a really strong background in the food business, starting with being marketing director at the Milk Development Council. And then he has substantial experience of selling food online. He's created and sold several food businesses. He also, through the cluster, runs some excellent webinars, which I can highly recommend. So, John, it's a real pleasure for you to be with us today. Thank you for coming. And perhaps I can pass over to you. And I think you're going to talk about the sale process and really remind us about some of the key points that we need to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, so as I like to remind people, I started life on a farm and I've worked my way up and down the supply chain several times, but particularly relevant to this is obviously working in food and drink businesses, many of which were mutual and or employee owned. So everything from milk marketing boards and milk marks, which of course in Wales became First Milk, a mutual, but also particularly in food and drink, dairies have got a long track record of trying to go down the mutualization route, not just to own the business, but to try and get economies of scale in the supply chain. The whole business of selling a business, I mean, you do have to ask yourself sometimes, why are you selling the business? And the first test I always have for trying to sell anything is, have you tried buying it? And of course, it gives you that view of the business in terms of how would it be viewed by other people? Because food and drink businesses are bought for all sorts of different reasons. I just mentioned the Milk Marketing Board. They turned around with their pension fund in the end and decided rather than invest in stocks and shares, they would buy a food and drink business because it was the most reliable way for them to secure a long-term, steady, but fairly unexciting return, but one that they could rely on. So it depends when you're selling a business, why you're selling or what you're selling, and who is that going to appeal to? And with food and drink, it's very often about not just the product that you make and how you make it, but how it sits in the supply chain and who the potential partners, collaborators, or competition are within that as to who maybe wants to buy your business. And therefore, you're trying to put your business in shape so that it appeals to people. Now, at the moment, we've had a very turbulent few years. I made the mistake, perhaps, of starting a food and drink business in 2007. Within a year, I was in major multiples, and then we had a banking crisis, and we had to go through some rather interesting structural changes to get it back on the road. Many businesses are experiencing exactly that at the moment. So selling a business that's distressed is difficult. And we talked about the two types of sale. We talked about the trade sale, the sale of shares, as opposed to perhaps just the asset sale, or what looks like what a company does when it's selling in administration or liquidation. But both are equally valid, just depends on the circumstances. So where is the value in the business is probably the first question. Is it what you make, the way you make it, and what's particularly good about the way that you approach the market? Branding, intellectual property, processes, and potentially patents and the like, and how well they're protected. But also the connection with the customer, the fact that you've built a franchise over time, and therefore it is that intangible element of the brand that's of value to people. And sometimes it might be a competitor because they want to buy that position in the market. So being able to tell that story is always very important. We talked earlier, I think it was Sarah who was saying about, you don't do this in a rush. This takes time. And anybody who wants to sell a business, I mean, when I sold mine, I looked into it, and the average was about, they said, about 18 months to sell a business. It took me a little bit longer, but we had a Brexit in the middle of it. The key thing being that, like most things in this life, if you want it badly, that's exactly how you'll get it. And trying to rush the sale of something like a business is never easy if you want to get the value from it. And the reason it takes time is because people want to check what it is they're buying. So we have this whole business of due diligence, or checking that the thing is actually what they say it is, and there's nothing hidden in there that's going to pose as a liability. So if you're doing a trade sale and you're selling shares, you're selling something as a going concern, people are going to want to kick the wheels on it fairly carefully to make sure that it is what it says it is. So that comes to this business of getting in shape. Having good management information systems. I'm a big fan of Xero. Some people like Sage. But either way, you've got to have a business that you can open the books to, and the books make sense to other people. And again, we talked about earlier about protecting the IP, and the fact that when you've got a potential competitor coming to look at your books, it's very important to have some sort of legal framework in terms of non-competes and non-disclosure agreements to ensure that they're actually taking it seriously. And in some of these instances, people do have quite a legal exchange and financial implications by going exclusive in terms of negotiations with a potential buyer. So that due diligence process is not just, do the books make sense? It's do things like, has the factory had the electric certificated in the last 2 years, or is there an inherent problem there? Or are there employees who fell down a flight of stairs and have yet to put their claim in? So there's all sorts of things that might come out of the woodwork that a business has as a responsibility, but it's also passes to potentially the new person who buys the business. Now, I personally sold a business in terms of an asset sale, but we had a brand. And one of the key things about that was that it meant you didn't have to sell everything all in one go. You can sell the means to make something, but also you can retain the IP, the brand, the processes, or license them out to people so that they can do something with it. So sale can take many forms. There are, of course, alternatives. And we've talked about one key one here today, which is this idea of the employees or the management taking part in the business. But that also, all just like anybody else buying the business, relies on their ability to afford the business. And when people buy businesses these days, it's not very often they come along because they've got a wallet that can afford the business. They tend to look at the business from the point of view of, can it afford to carry the debt that's going to pay for them buying the business? And that's exactly the same for employees or management who want to get involved with running the business and owning a stake in it. Is that business able to demonstrate over a number of years that it is capable of carrying that debt, being sustainable, and still having the ability to grow? Now, in the olden days, when we had farm co-ops who wanted to grow, they very often mutualized and then bought downstream businesses because they could make or take advantages of the savings that could be made by owning more of the processes on the way to the market. And that is potentially one of the ways that people or new people can look at a business and say, well, we can take it in a different direction, and we can demonstrate that we can either get higher growth or a better revenue return. But these things need to be modeled and they need to be demonstrated, because somebody's got to, at a bank, has got to be able to say, yes, we buy this story and we'll lend you the money to do it, given that we'll need some security. And most importantly, this then demonstrates this ability to give shareholder value. And most businesses are there to deliver for shareholders. And one of the things that shareholders often want is to see that they've got not just good governance, but a good management team. And Paul was talking about this earlier, that this whole idea of businesses and succession planning relies on good management and good governance. Is there a plan? How is it going to be implemented? What are the risks and mitigations for it? Because these are the things that not only are needed to attract shareholder funds, but help the shareholders or potential shareholders get the money that they need to raise to acquire the business. So, why are you selling and what are you selling? Is it got or has it got a track record that's demonstrable both in numbers and in the market that it's worth the money? The valuation that you put on it, very difficult for people to, as Paul already said about doing valuations. It is in the eye of the beholder, and it depends on the investment strategy that people might have for buying a business. But of course, many mutuals and or employee-owned businesses can take a longer-term view on that, but they'll need to demonstrate to the bank that they can still fund it. So those valuations are an element of it, but they're not the be-all and end-all, because it's about carrying debt as well. Will it pass due diligence? Is there a legal framework to ensure that the shares and or the IP of the business are protected and can be carried across, and any liabilities handled or risks that arise from those? And then, does it have a plan for how it's going to continue into the future to either grow and give a capital return and or throw off dividends to pay for the debt? Paul, I think that was a slightly longer summary than a summary, but.
Thank you, John. Sorry, can we have the next slide, please, Ebony? And the next one again, thank you. So, John, you've led me on nicely, really, I suppose, to the support that we can offer under the Social Business Wales programme for those interested in going down this route. I mean, the valuation has been mentioned a number of times, and I think one of the advantages of becoming a client of the project is you get an independent valuation to get the ball rolling, because we think that's a good starting point in terms of, gaining an idea of what the business is actually worth and flagging up any potential issues that may need sorting out. And quite often, on the back of that independent valuation, we can offer sort of specialist tax advice as well if there are any issues that are flagged up. As Sarah mentioned earlier, the support we provide is fully subsidised. And I suppose we don't see sort of the transition to employee ownership as a simply sort of legal process or financial process. I think, it's very important, as Case mentioned earlier, that the staff, the employees and the business owners fully understand every sort of step of the process. And, I think that's where we can add value in terms of working with both the business owners and the employees, ensuring that they do understand, what the options are, how they might be financed. So John and Paul have mentioned a number of sort of issues to consider when it comes to sort of, looking at the affordability of the business, how it might be financed, what the options are, and also so that the employee team can be confident that that business will perform as it needs to repay any debt finance, for example. So, for that purpose, we will provide business planning support, financial modelling support to the client. Usually the employee team are quite keen to get involved in that process as well as the business owner. And also we'll sort of introduce you then to potential lenders and also to, law firms that, you may want to work with then to take things forward and complete. So, hopefully that gives you a broad overview of the support that we can provide. What I would say is that, that the whole team, we're always very happy to sort of, speak to people over the telephone or video calls as we're now used to. If you just want to find out more, and just speak generally about it, in terms of what your next steps might be. So if you do have any questions that you don't want to, you know, ask today during the session, then please, you know, pick up the phone and give us a bell. So I think, Ebony, you know, that leads us on nicely to the question and answer session. So I'll hand over to you.
Hi there. Yeah, we've had a few questions in the chat room, so I'll take these in order. The first question is about succession planning. Could you have a combination of family succession and family ownership? If so, is there any advice on the best way to divide this? So I don't know who in the team wants to take that question. Paul, maybe, if you're there.
Yeah, sorry. This is about setting a family business, but retaining some interest for the family. I mean, yes, that can be done. In fact, I've got a client at the moment who the sons had not expressed any interest in wanting to be part of the business, and never had really. And then discussions started to take place about succession planning, as you can imagine, as the owner was getting older and his wife was getting older as well, and they were co-owning the business. All of a sudden, the two sons have now expressed an interest in being involved. And so we're having discussions at the moment about how they can be involved in a way that suits them, but at the same time helps the business. A management buyout was being considered by the management team, and management buyouts can be a bit kind of shaky, really. They can, there's a lot of responsibility on people who take part in management buyouts, because they have to find money. They may often have to give personal guarantees to lenders, not always. I know Bank of Wales sometimes doesn't, but nevertheless, it's a responsible process, really. And in this particular case, the appearance of the two sons has actually strengthened the conviction of the management team that they can make it work, because actually one of the sons has some skills which were missing from the main management team. I don't know whether that addresses the issue or not, really, but that was my interpretation of the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Paul. Thank you for that. A question that Sarah, you've sort of dealt with this in the chat room, but I'm going to read it out because I think there may be further discussion around this. What happens if the full shareholding held by the Employee Ownership Trust isn't taken up by its workforce and members? So just a clarification of that, all employees in, really, I think possibly Paul on that one.
Yes, I mean, I think there's possibly some confusion creeping in here about the way the shares are owned by the trust. The shares in the trust in an EOT are owned by the trust under the control of the trustees, and for the sole benefit of the employees. But the trust, the shares are not allocated to individual employees at all. So, so a new employee coming will eventually be a beneficiary by virtue of qualification, usually 6 months service. When they leave, they continue to usually, depending on the trust deed and how that's written, they can remain beneficiaries for a period of time, but then their beneficiary role will cease. So it's really a model which is about stability of employment, and works really well in some areas where you know, employees want to stay and maybe have to stay because of the employment market, working for a single employer. So in that sense, the shares are not written down against individual employees in that model, and they are all held by the trust. Does that help?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that. Another one regarding shares and EOTs. Once shares are sold to the EOT by the vendor, can shares be bought back at any future date?
The answer to that is yes, they can. But if there's been a tax relief claimed, which there probably will be, if a majority of shares have been sold to a trust by an owner or by owners, it doesn't have to be one owner, it can be a number of owners collectively selling a majority. Once that tax is claimed, then obviously that tax relief is claimed in the transaction, then obviously you can't then sell those shares back to the owner for obvious reasons. It wouldn't make sense. So yes, they can be sold, but it must not. The trust must always be in a majority if that tax relief has been claimed.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul.
I think, Ebony, I'm just going to say it might be worth adding to that, in that the basis of an employee ownership trust actually is about longevity. So it tends to be about the shares being sold to the trust for the future. So you wouldn't then be looking at buying those shares back. That's not what tends to happen. As Paul said, it can happen, but actually is not the purpose really of the trust.
Oh, thank you for that, Sarah. I'm just scrolling through the chat because we've had a few more questions. A question here: can the selling of shares to the employee ownership trust be agreed in advance between the trustees and the vendor on a phased approach?
Yes, it can, and it's precisely the model which Case uses at Tregroyce. In other words, there is a sale and purchase agreement which sets out share sales over a period of years, and every year, assuming that everything's all right, and obviously the money has to be there, which it has been in that case, then it can be sold phase-wise like that, and gradually the trust can then have a majority of shares. Another example is Aber Instruments, which is a very well-known company employee-owned company in Mid Wales. They went through exactly that process. Gradually, shares were sold, and the trust now has a majority of those shares.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question here in the chat. With an employee ownership trust, can management roles be given better incentives than regular employees, or is it completely equal? To do this, would you need a mix of both employee ownership trust and share option growth shares, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I think that basically there's nothing to prevent managers having the normal incentives that they would have. So there's no reason why they can't have a performance incentive plan. Most managers would expect to get one of those. And the owners would expect them to achieve it. And
can I add something there?
Please do.
I would say that the trust, in a way, has got absolutely nothing to do with the day-to-day running of the trading company. I am not a communist. I am a sort of a communist, but I'm not a communist. The business is run by a management team, and the management team gets rewarded according to the job that they do. We don't have a SUMA idea where everybody gets the same pay or anything like that. We run the business just as commercially as we've always run it before. And we got a production manager and a sales team, and there is nothing weird or wonderful about it. The only thing that is weird and wonderful about Tregroyce Waffles from that point of view is that whatever is left in profits doesn't go to me personally, but it is decided by the trustees of the trust what has been done with that profit and how that is being sorted out. That's where the trust comes in. But the way that the business runs, is just as commercial and exactly the same. Nothing has changed from that point of view, really, at all.
Thanks, Keith. I think that's a really helpful comment, because people get the idea, do have the idea sometimes, that trust-owned companies are somehow kind of Alice in Wonderland territory. Well, they're not, and there are a lot of them, and all the ones that I've been involved with operate in exactly the same principle that you've just very clearly set out. So yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, can I just add something to that as well?
Yeah, sure.
Well, a well-run business would normally be able to go out and borrow money and then provide a return to their shareholders in excess of what that money cost. And there is a risk sometimes when we talk about shares that some people think, oh, well, the shares are for trading and making something of the business. I think in this instance, the sort of philosophical debate is about profit sharing, isn't it? It's about giving people a share in the business and a share in its success, rather than the sort of trading of shares in the way that maybe other businesses do. And there's, you know, if there are other models that might suit people who've got a business that needs to raise large amounts of capital and can't do it with debt, they could go and look at crowdfunding. But when businesses are on a more stable footing and making longer term plans, that's where this debate then about who owns the business and who benefits from the business becomes more important, because it binds people in for the longer term.
Yeah, John, I think, you know, you make a very valid point there, because what we find that actually what counts most for people is that sense of ownership and control over the business that they belong to. It goes without saying then that the share in any profit that business makes is a nice to have and is an important sort of feature of owning that company. But absolutely, I think the sort of share ownership really relates directly to that sense of ownership and control over the business.
Brilliant, thanks for that, guys. Bran, while you're there, if we have another question here. If you were earlier in your business planning looking at how the business can become sustainable and move away from sole trader to limited company, and wanting to incorporate succession planning into this, would it be an appropriate time to speak to you or one of the other advisors, or does this typically happen later in the business planning phase?
Well, I think, you know, as a team, our motto is it's never too early to start looking at this. I think the earlier you look at it, the better you can plan for it. And what we would say, you know, is by all means pick up the phone. Every business is different, obviously. And what we find, you know, it depends what the business is, what assets they own, what sort of personal tax planning as well is going on in the background. You know, all that needs to be sort of looked at in its entirety. So it's very difficult to give generic advice, but what we would say is the earlier somebody picks up the phone to us, the earlier we can sort of, you know, make people aware of what they need to be considering and looking at, and, you know, and helping them on that journey.
And I was just, sorry, Paul. I was just going to say, actually, Paul mentioned earlier about Aber Instruments. Aber Instruments, very successful company across the world. They were a spin out of the university in Aberystwyth, but that business was set up with employee ownership as part of its strategy from the very outset by the 4 original owners. So before they looked at things like trusts and share plans, they were actually on an annual basis in a very loose fashion looking at selling shares to their employees, because they've got a hybrid model. They have trust and direct share ownership. So it just proves that actually this model, it can be utilized anywhere. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think succession is about business as usual. So it's about planning constantly, really. It's not about the kind of coming to the end and saying, right, what do I do now? It is about business as usual and being an evolution, a journey, an evolution. So it's, you know, so as Bran said, never too early or never too late to talk to us.
Paul, just one of the lessons we've had from this pandemic in the last year is that those smaller food and drink businesses that were going along as a sole trader and maybe hadn't registered for things like VAT as well, because they thought, well, we'll see how we go along before we make those decisions. They've actually lost out in many ways in terms of support and or their ability or resilience to the pandemic. It's very well worthwhile getting advice if you're a sole trader as to what the most appropriate legal structure is for you. You know, great. I was told by some private equity guys a long time ago, you should always plan for the size of business you want to be in 5 years' time now.
Yeah.
So yes, good point. Yes,
Yes.
good point.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. We've just had one last question here. Do all employees have an equal share within an EOT, assuming all employees are within the indirect ownership model?
Yes, the answer to that is yes. The trustees' job, in fact, is to ensure that all of the employees are treated equally.
Yeah.
And it's part of the conditions that are written into the Finance Act in relation to ensuring that trusts are properly managed for the benefit of employees. And you know, if you didn't treat employees differently, for example, the one I mentioned, sometimes people say, well, could I lend as a trustee? Could I lend to one of the employees? They've approached me and they've said, could we lend them some money? Well, the answer to that is that you can't, because you know that would not be treating everybody the same within the company. So the equality principle is quite important, and so those rules I mentioned, without going over them again, have to be observed. They're very simple, but they have to be observed. Otherwise, any tax benefit could potentially unravel.
Yeah, yes, that's very true, Paul. But at the moment, we are, because we are in this process of transferring shares from the family to the trust. There isn't massive big sums of money left over them to share out between the employees. And what the trust has decided with us over the years is not for the trust to give a dividend on the shareholding as such to every employee, but that the management team can decide in their wisdom to pay a bonus to employees, and that can be done at several levels again. Then that can be sort of done within the framework of the trading company rather than in the framework of the trust.
Yes, I think that's perfectly reasonable case.
Yes.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable approach.
Quite. So but what it enables us, in answer to the question that was asked, is it enables us to still make some sort of difference between employees. Although the principle of the trust obviously is to treat everybody equal, it still enables us flexibility to reward people in different manners as we see fit within the trading company.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think as well worth noting. So if we think about John Lewis as the sort of one everybody knows, annually they publish, don't they, the percentage that well, not this year anyway, but annually they publish what percentage of profit the employees are going to get, but that doesn't. But they will do that on a scale basis, so
Yes,
it doesn't mean
right.
That's exactly what you just said, Case. So basically, you know, it depends on, you know, where you are in the company, and it's a percentage of whatever you are. So so it tends to be work. Some EOTs like to give a blanket, you know, 5,000 say, or whatever it is, but others will pay according to pay structure. So. Yeah.
And you can take length of service into consideration as well, can't you? You know, so as long as it's a fair system.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And transparent, isn't it, really? So everybody actually understands how it works.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks for that, guys. John, we've got a question for you here. John, is there anyone within Business Wales you would recommend talking to with regards from shifting away from a sole trader model to a limited company, hypothetically with an EOT trust model alongside?
I did, Ebony, I did actually answer Ellen to say that
There we go.
if she was looking at an EOT specifically, then we would be able to look at all of that aspect with her. So there's no problem.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have in the chat room. It's been lively. So thanks very much, guys, for your answers to those.
Oh, thanks to very much, to everybody for attending the webinar, and also to John and Case. It's really appreciated that you've taken time out to come and talk to everybody today.
And we'll be, Ebony will be sending out an email to everybody, which will have the link to this recording on it, so that you can look at it at your leisure, but also as well, it'll have the presentation. And if you go to the next slide, Ebony, please. All our details, contact details are on there. So, please just pick up the phone, or as you say, or email, and we'll be happy to speak to anybody who just wants a bit more information. We always love talking to people. So, yes. So thank you to everybody for today.
Good.